All right, we are continuing on in Hebrews 11. So if you'd like to head over there, that'll help you find where we are at. Last week we were talking about legacy, generations of faith, and this week we're going to be talking about the identity of faith. Last week when I was mentioning, things that you may have inherited from your family members, you guys heard some stories about my mama and some of the features I thought I inherited from her, but have you ever thought about also those other characteristics that you might have inherited from somebody? Maybe some personality traits. Thought about how you might identify maybe with one parent or one side of your family a little more than another. When I think of identity, that's what I start to think of. Where did we grow up? Who did we grow up around? Who raised us? All these things form our identity. What country, what language we speak, all of these things are part of it. What culture we're a part of are all part of our identity. So when we think about a faith identity, which we're going to explore today, to think about those things in a different way. How do we identify with the identity of faith? Let's have another quick word of prayer. Lord, today, help us to identify with you. Help us to see through all the other layers we might have and closely be connected to you. Amen. So a big question that a lot of us ask, particularly, let's say, in our teen years, I would say especially, early 20s, in the back of most people's minds is this question, who am I? Most of us go through that. That kind of seems to be an age-old question. You may have thought about that from time to time. But there's something about growing up that makes that question really, really important. And there's lots of ways people try to figure out, who am I? And as a person with internet access and always liking to go look for something fun to do, I went to the internet and said, well, how do people go around and explore who are they? And this is what I've come up with. Feel free to laugh if you're like, what is happening here? You guys ever taken these personality quizzes? You ever went on and did this, and you see them, they're all over the place, and it's like, what princess are you from this movie? What character are you from this thing? What da-da-da? And if you haven't, it's okay, but it does exist. But they have ones, as you will see, and yes, I took all these just for you guys so you could see this. They have ones that, what animal might you be like? Why are these things so popular? Have you ever thought about that? I like taking them. Some of them are a little more ridiculous than others, and sometimes you have trouble answering questions, but why do we take these things? Right? Because we want to kind of know more about ourselves. There's something about that reflective piece. It gets a little confusing, as you can see. On one quiz, I was an owl. Okay. But then on the next quiz, I was a sloth. I feel like those aren't exactly compatible. But according to those quizzes, somehow I had some characteristics of an owl and a sloth. And I'm sure if I took it another time, I might have been something else. And I also took the planet quiz. Hey, if you want to, have a little bit of fun, go over to BBC and look for their quizzes. They have all kinds of random just quizzes about Earth and things. I got to be the planet Neptune. I thought that was kind of fun. We read these things and obviously take them with a grain of salt. I don't actually think I'm Neptune or a sloth or anything like that. But it's kind of fun to look at these things, right? Because you get some feedback about aspects of your character and who am I? And does that kind of reflect me? Is there a part of me that's in these? This is why we take these things. And we can be a little more serious. In my line of work, I sometimes have people take personality quizzes, not are you a sloth or an owl or something like that, something with a little more science behind it. And those are really fascinating to people too, because they can tell us things like, are you more introverted or extroverted? Are you somebody who is very much about the details, or are you a big picture person? Where do you lean? All those things can tell us things that can help us in our daily lives, and we can identify with those things. So I'm not suggesting today that in Hebrews 11 that you're going to find out what kind of identity of faith. We're not going to make a list of anything like that. But I wanted to point out this question is very, very important, and Hebrews 11 helps us answer this in the story of a man named Moses. So, in Moses, what we're going to see here is we're going to see that he had a faith legacy to begin with. He had parents that were faithful. We're going to see how part of his faith identity was formed. And then we're going to look at some of the actions that came from that faith identity being formed. So Hebrews 11:23, let's get started. So Hebrews 11:23 says, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So if you remember from the previous verses, we had several verses in a row about Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and all the things that they had said and the actions of faith related to them were all actually related to their deathbed. They were dying. When they were dying, this is what they said. And yet here we get over into 23. Here's the cycle of life, and we have a birth. And we have a new story. And we see by the faith of who? Moses' parents. So this isn't Moses, but this is important because our identities are formed by the people that raise us as well. But his parents hid him for those 3 months. And it says something very important at the end of that because they were not afraid of the king's edict. So let's take a deeper look at this story. Let's go to Exodus 2. And remember, at this point in Israelites' history, Joseph has been forgotten. That's where we left off actually in Hebrews, was Joseph was an important man. The pharaohs knew who he was, but at this point he's been forgotten and they've been enslaved. Now in Exodus 2, we see, now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, which is what we just heard from Hebrews, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch, and then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. So we know that Pharaoh's daughter ends up coming down. And she comes down to the bank. I'm going to summarize some of this. She hears a baby crying. And Miriam, being the older sister, runs over, right, and offers the help of, shall I go get a Hebrew woman to nurse the child? Knowing very well this is her brother, she's going to go get her mom. And of course, the Pharaoh's daughter was like, yep, go do that, go do all that. So God provided a way here through this mother's faith and father's, because it said his parents, it's not just mom, to provide for the fact that Moses gets to grow up in this place of bounty in the Egyptian palace, but spends many, many years in the care of his mother with the permission of the Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter to do this. So she has kind of a time limit going on here to share who Moses is. Who is he? In light of, yes, he's living in this palace, he's been taken in by this very wealthy family, if you will. Who is he? So she takes this in. But I want to pause here to say, what we're looking at here is that godly role models are very important. Sometimes those are our parents. I hope they are our parents. Sometimes that is not the case. Not everybody has parents that are godly role models. But here's the thing. God allows people to shape people. We do influence each other. We can have influence on each other. And one of the things that I think is so incredible about this verse is that same boldness that you see when his parents took the leap to hide him. That could not have been easy. Those of you who are mothers, could you imagine actually taking your kid into some water in a little basket and hoping for the best? I mean, the moms among you. Yeah, especially with, crocodiles living there. The moms among you are probably thinking, I don't know, right? But what courage, right, to be willing to do that. And it said they weren't actually afraid. You might say, well, why are they hiding him in there? But they had a plan, right? Plan worked out actually quite well. But the same boldness you can see in Moses later in his life. You might not think about that. You might just think, oh, Moses was just bold. That came out of nowhere. And God made him bold. I agree with that. But he had bold parents. He had parents that set him up well. And we may or may not have parents that set him up well, but I bet if you think over your lifetime, there have been people that have influenced you in a good way, in a godly way, that have role modeled for you. Sometimes they're going to know it because you're close to them. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're people that you have just interacted with briefly. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember, that we shape each other, we influence each other. And Moses didn't come out of a vacuum, and his parents were very bold people. But next we look at verses 24 to 26. So we've seen Moses' parents. We've seen that they have faith. They created a nice foundation for him to start off on. But Moses has to, as we've talked about over and over again, you can't actually inherit somebody's faith, right? You got to decide for yourself. You can be influenced that way. Now we see that by faith, Moses, not Moses' parents anymore, Moses himself, so Moses has taken on this, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. We see Moses is born, he's hidden away. He's raised by his mom for several years anyways. And then he's in a place at that time in history where, you guys know I went to Egypt this past year, got to see a lot of history of Egypt and learn a lot about this time frame on our tour as well. And a little bit of a side note in case you're interested in or wondering. I know at one point I mentioned that Joseph had served now they think probably under 2 pharaohs. So it kind of blew my mind. But they think too, and this was our tour guide, Dr. Carl Kozart was with us, was explaining that they actually think that Moses' Egyptian mother, we'll say, was Queen Hatshepsut. Can't hardly even say it. But if you recognize that name, you're going to really get a picture of what Moses was up against. A lot of family turmoil in the Egyptian family. We actually went to Queen Hatshepsut's temple, mortuary temple, funerary temple, because this was a thing that they did in Egypt. They had the pyramids at one point. Later, actually, in Moses' time, they're building temples for themselves, these kind of funeral temples. She wasn't buried there. She was buried elsewhere, but this is what she left behind. It's actually pretty neat. But there was a lot of turmoil. And when you look at what happened, here's another reason why this makes sense of like Moses probably was in this time frame. There was a vacuum right ahead of Queen Hatshepsut in terms of who was going to be in charge. And we know from other places in Ellen G. White's writing and stuff like that, our Moses that we're talking about was in line. It tells us right here he stepped out. So he steps out. History, if you will, and Egyptian history continues on. Somebody's got to fill the gap. Well, the princess steps in and takes over power, and it causes quite a stir, and I'm not going to go into all the details. He had other family members that were trying to step in. There was a lot of friction. So when you look at it from thinking about what we know secularly, what's happening about the time that we think Moses might have been there, you can kind of see that, one, Moses could have easily been caught up in all this turmoil. Talk about dysfunctional families, right? But it tells us right here he refuses. He refuses to be aligned with whatever's going on here. And they had a lot of power. They had a lot of stuff. We were talking about stuff earlier. They're building these funeral temples. I mean, the Egyptian pharaohs especially were all about, like, what's my physical legacy going to be? I'm leaving a pyramid. I'm trying to leave something bigger than the guy before me so that people remember me forever. They were very much into everlasting life, just not in the way that we think of it as Christians. But Moses right here, it says, by faith he refused. He refused to step in line and to take that on. And he chose instead, this is really important, not only did he just refuse, I'm not going to be associated with that, that's not going to be me, but he chose instead to be aligned with a different set of people who were being mistreated and afflicted. And it says something, why? Because he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value. Right? He understood that when he was looking here in Egypt, looking around him, all the riches and turmoil, sure, he could have had that for a time, but he understood this was just for a time. This wasn't of eternal value. But he was willing to align with a different set of people because he was looking ahead to the actual eternal reward. So I want to say a little word on identity again here, because I think this is important. Moses chose God's identity for him. He was not defined by circumstances, but by what God had said. In doing so, rejecting basically a lucrative identity makes complete sense. And God honors his faithfulness. Now, I want to say something here as we take a deeper look here, that Moses did not quite see the whole picture. He got enough of it, and sometimes a lot of us are like that. He got enough of it to understand, I don't want this. And he did early on which we're going to see upcoming, early on, let kind of his idea of like what God was doing with him carry him away. But in the meantime, I just want to recognize that he had to grow into that faith identity. And so we're going to look at a couple of verses here about faith. Faith is a growing and living thing. I think we know that, but I want to pause here to point this out, because sometimes we think of, oh, if I say yes to God, I'm going to be like perfect Christian, ready to go. And that's not how that works. Just telling you. The Bible says that's not how it works. We grow into that. And so a couple of verses to keep in mind. 1 Corinthians 13:11 says, "When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me." So Paul's talking about what? He's actually talking about growing up in faith. He's not just talking about physically how we grow up, but he's using that as a metaphor to say, when you're a child, you understand things a certain way. You get older, you develop along, and as you become an adult, things should change. We should be able to mature. And Paul talks about that in other places as well. In 1 Corinthians 14:20, it says, "Undoubtedly there are all sorts of languages in the world, yet none of them is without meaning." Now you might say, what does that have to do with anything languages? What he's trying to get them to understand here is that, think about for a second how anybody speaks a second language or know parts of other languages. I know some Spanish. I'm not saying I can speak it fluently, but I do know some Spanish. And I can remember a time when I was first learning Spanish, it was high school for me, looking at those words meant nothing to me. I'm like, okay, there's a bunch of words here. But my Spanish teacher, sure as anything, could look at that and tell you this is what the sentence says. And the more I got into it and the more I studied it, the more I could then go back later and go, oh, it says, this is my favorite cat or whatever. This is my favorite dog. The more you study it, the more the language has meaning. And now I can read a little bit more. And there's all kinds of things you can do to learn languages now. But the idea of it is you've got to learn, progress in it, hear it, be a part of it until it makes sense. This is kind of like the Christian faith too, particularly if you haven't grown up in it or coming into it. Like your initial moments might be like, what is this foreign language? What's this Bible thing about? What's all this? You start little by little. You learn and learn until you learn. I'm going to call it the language of faith, until you learn the language of faith. And then Ephesians 4:13 says, "Until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ." Like I said, Paul has a lot to say about growing in that living and active faith in Christ, and noticing that Moses had chose to grow himself into that faith. One other thing I want to mention here, because in the verse we had just read about Moses, it talked about him aligning with those who had been mistreated. Obviously, his fellow Hebrews, people that he was literally related to as well. And I want to mention this. Pain, affliction is not always a sign of being on the wrong path. It can be character shaping. I think we know that. Certainly, there are times where pain is a signal. It is. Signal about something. Maybe something's big one we think of is something's injured in the body, but sometimes that signal is also just telling you something like, I don't like something. It may not be a physical pain, but it doesn't always mean that you're on the wrong path. So I think we hear words like that and you go, why would anybody choose to be in pain? That doesn't sound good. Think again about growing up. Did you ever have growing pains, as they say? I know I did, like actually growing, where my legs hurt, legs are growing or whatever. I know I didn't get very tall, but at one point I was shorter and then I got taller, a little bit taller. Some of you maybe will remember that more. You actually have literal growing pains. You also have the growing pains of learning different things as you grow up. All of those things are a part of the growing process. And so I want to point that out because in Moses' case, especially aligning himself with the people that were being mistreated, the Hebrews, was really much more about growing instead of about somehow he was being punished or on the wrong path or whatever. So finally we get to the actions of faith. And there's a lot in the story of Moses, as you well know, that's summarized in this book of Hebrews. It's all squished in there because here we have two things that look like they come back to back, but if you know the story of Moses, it doesn't happen this way. But it says this: by faith he left Egypt. Here's those words we saw about his parents. Not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, He kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. So remember I said a moment ago, after Moses basically sets his mind, I am not going to be associated with Pharaoh and his family. I'm going to align with God's people. He had some growing to do, right? We see him, what are they referring to here when it says by faith, not fearing, he left Egypt. He left Egypt because he had killed another man, another Egyptian, when he's thinking in his head, oh, I'm gonna save God's people, like they're gonna follow me. That's what the story is. If you go back and look at it and look what Ellen White says about it too, more expansive. But if you go look at the story, he's on their side, but he's a little overzealous and he's running ahead of God. And he has to leave Egypt. And we know between these two sentences, there's a lot of time that has happened. God has sent him out into the wilderness. It doesn't say this here, but you go back in Exodus, you go see this, and God is working on him. God is growing him, as I was just saying, so that when he comes back, which is sentence number 2, we got 40-some years between this or so, it then can say, by faith he kept the Passover. Because what has happened, not only has he been out and God has grown him, but he has got himself connected correctly with God, if you will, and is like, oh, okay, God, we're going to do it your way this time, and goes in, and we see all the plagues, and this is the last plague that we see right here. Okay, so he's already gone through to Pharaoh and already said, let my people go, etc., multiple times, and it says this, by faith he kept the Passover. And what's the significance of this Passover? This is the first time we see the Passover. Significance of this, right, is they were at that Passover literally killing the lamb, putting the blood on the door. All of this pointing towards what? Christ, the sacrifice he was going to make, and that when we are in the blood of Christ, we are passed over by the destroyer. And so, remember, this is the first time they've seen this. Moses doesn't have the history we have to know all this. I'm sure he understands it's pointing ahead, but he doesn't know the future of this. But he knows enough to keep the Passover, right, so that the destroyer of the firstborn, and he's commended for doing that. I mean, think about all the things you can think that Moses could be commended about. He's commended for that particular thing. And these are it in Hebrews. This is the last verse you see in Hebrews about by faith and Moses. I'm sure he did other things by faith, but this is the last that Paul gives us in the writings about Moses. And it ends on what we saw at the beginning, that faithfulness and that understanding that this was bigger than he was, and that it was rooted in something bigger than he was. Now, you've seen this before. Faithful actions come from a faith-based. We've seen that over and over again with the triangle, right? These actions that Moses is taking doesn't come out of a vacuum. And it actually comes out of his identity, bringing our word back in Christ, right? It comes back to he has identified himself with Christ. So we want to take a few moments then to talk a little bit more about, well, how do we even make this faith formation? How is that even done? And here's a couple of verses. You can find many more, or one verse, I should say, and one from Ellen White's writings. And this is Romans 10:17. Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. What does this tell us about how faith is formed? Faith starts at the head. You've got to hear the message, right? We don't want it to just stay there. We don't want it to stay as head knowledge, but somebody's got to tell you or show you in some way that there is such thing as a faith identity, there is such thing as a God, etc. You've got to hear the message, right? Now, eventually, in order to identify with this, we've got to go to a deeper level, and you've got to be able to take that to your heart, which is, what do they say? This is the greatest distance to travel is from your head to your heart. But I like what Ellen White says in Education about this. This is taking it to heart knowledge. It says faith, and this is my word, is as simple as, she says, faith is trusting God, believing that he loves us and knows best what is for our good. Thus, instead of our own, it leads us to choose his way. Faith is as simple as trusting. We develop that faith, we identify with with God. We identify with his character. Just like, for better or for worse sometimes, hopefully in the good sense, you identify with your family. You have some similar character traits, right? You might look like each other, you might not. But you identify with them on that level, right? We're family. This is the essence of that. Your family with God. Your identity is in God. So you knew this was coming because you've seen it in all the times that I've preached on this. Our lovely little faith review. Let's bring it back to what we've been looking at. That faith, right? We just heard a moment ago, faith is about trusting God, right? Trust falls into this. It's the confidence, that assurance, that hope. And what we were just talking about, that identity with Moses, is rooted in this same pyramid. It doesn't start because Moses somehow is doing all these good things. He did do good things by our standards, but it doesn't start there, right? It starts from the base of Christ's righteousness, Christ's identity, and Moses decides in his life to be connected with that. He decides, okay, I'm going to identify, I'm going to take on the faith, the identity of Christ. And from that place, God utilizes him to this very top of this pyramid. Those actions and those things that we see him doing in Egypt, when he comes back in and is able to not only go to Pharaoh, but it says was faithful in keeping the Passover. In other words, pointing people towards the sacrifice of Christ, pointing people towards, this is what's really going to save you, not Moses. That's what he could identify with. It wasn't Moses. It was God. So today I want to leave you with this. Moses chose to identify with God and his people. And today I want you to think about, who are you? Who do you identify with? Are you willing to be on God's side? Are you willing to take that faith step? If you've already taken the faith step, do you need to lean into it? Do you need to trust more? God will take you there. It's not because you're going to do something more, but you're going to trust. And in that way, you will also be, as Moses was, identified with God.